meeting you, Christina, in the Bronx, and meeting your parents, knowing how much you love family, and his capacity to travel across time, relationships, and zip codes, holding us all up, living what Judith Butler would call a social ontology, understanding that in the networks of bodies and affects, we are all vulnerable. I have a sense that he might have carried us a lot. And he always made space for others, maybe too generously, moving over to make space for someone he was not. And so with warm and sad hugs to all of you, to the cousins, to the parents, to the sister, and to the wife, we will miss Greg enormously.
Good afternoon. My name's Amy Stich. I'm one of Greg's quirky former students. It is true. I'll claim that identity. A special thank you to Nadine and Adam for allowing me to be part of this. I'm very grateful. As a mentor, though he didn't really like that word, Greg taught me so much. From what it means to be a critical scholar, to the artistic intention behind the Marc Rothko print hanging on my office wall, from the intricacies of Bordusian reflexivity to the history of hip-hop. And he approached all of these things with a profound humility, a testament to his insatiable appetite for learning, and sincere appreciation for all forms of knowledge. His was an intellect so deep that it continues provoking and it continues teaching, even in his physical absence. One of the most powerful, lasting lessons Greg taught to me was about failure. The lesson began as I knocked nervously at Greg's office door sometime in late February of 2012. And I was there to discuss my first campus interview and what I perceived to be my first epic fail on the academic job market. Between the door and its frame, I could see him pushing up his sleeves on his oversized sweatshirt, adjusting the volume on his Mac, sipping on a diet soda. Wearing his boyish grin, he welcomed me with his usual elongated, "Hey," waving to me from a mere 5 feet away. Above his desk, there were 2 calendars tacked to the bulletin board. One featured photographs of tiny kittens, and the other DC comic book heroes. I recall a few shelves sagging under the weight of well-used books, and student papers pushing out of folders, towering in a corner. I imagine Greg's office was a lot like his brain, packed with knowledge and music and kindness and color. Below all of this beautiful chaos, I slouched into recounting my failed campus visit. He listened intently, as he always did, and then, in solidarity and with great seriousness, he told me a story about his own failures, his lead bouncing along as usual to the speed of his rapid-fire thoughts. But this was not just a gesture in solidarity or a supportive push, not entirely. And this was more than a lesson in persistence. This was about rethinking popular conceptions of failure, understanding that without it we're unable to move forward. This was about living an examined life. A couple of years later, I was reminded of that day when I noticed a link to an article he posted to Facebook with a corresponding personal message. And he said, "The ability to deal with failure or rejection is one of, if not the most important personality traits of the most successful, broadly defined people I know. If you're not failing, You're not pushing hard enough. Greg was indeed a wonderful mentor, despite his disapproval of the term. He taught you and then he reminded you in big, critical, important ways to think, in big, critical, important ways, all the while demonstrating a rare model humility. I've always known the worth of Greg's mentorship, one that was professional and personal and supportive and honest and loyal. And as much as I miss him here, the value of his mentorship is glaringly infinite, still pushing me forward with a creative, critical consciousness. How lucky am I? How lucky are we to have known such a man? Thank you.
This is Marc Lamont Hill. This is incredibly difficult. I anticipated it being incredibly difficult, but even more so as I'm here and listening to everyone share their stories and sharing our tears, I'm moved by a lot of things, and I'll be really brief. First, Greg has this amazing way of forging a special relationship with everybody. Everybody walks away from a relationship with Greg feeling like they're almost his best friend. And you kind of are. You know, it's not the fake academic thing, like you really kind of are. I first met Greg, how appropriately, at a Tupac conference at Harvard in 2003, March of 2003. I was a graduate student, and Greg was a junior faculty member. And he was on the panel with intellectual heavyweights at the Harvard Center. And with typical Greg humility, he was masterful. And he wasn't trying to put on an intellectual performance, he was just so daggone smart. And he knew so much, and to your point, I mean, it really is like that first time you read like Dialectic of Freedom, or Releasing the Imagination, like a Maxine Green book where, you just wish you knew all that stuff and had read all that and heard all those symphonies and knew all those references. Greg just knew them. He just knew them, and he was brilliant. And I approached him after I was working on thinking about my dissertation. You know that stage in graduate school, you think you know exactly what you want to do until the next week. And I walked up to Greg and I said, hey, I'm studying hip hop and I'm in the field of education, and I would love to work with you or get some advice from you. And he said, let's just grab coffee. Let's just talk. And I was incredibly intimidated, and many people have said that before, let's grab coffee and talk, at conferences, and then the next conference comes and you don't get coffee, you don't talk. And then AERA came, and I went to Greg's panel, and again, he was amazing, and we sat down and we talked for 2 hours. He didn't know me, he didn't know anything about me. He just asked lots of interesting questions, and the questions that he asked were as important as the information that he offered. He was genuinely interested in other people's work. And afterward, I wanted him to be on my dissertation committee, and I asked Kathy Schultz, my advisor, I said, can I ask Greg to be on my committee? And she said, you can try, but, and asking someone to be on your committee is kind of like asking someone on the prom, it's this awkward moment. And I said, Greg, if possible, could you? He's like, if you want me to be on your committee, I'd be honored. And he really kind of always is. It's not false humility. Greg is so humble that he is was genuinely excited and proud to be part of people's projects, and to know that people took his work seriously enough to ask him things and to value him. And for me, that was another marker of Greg's importance. As someone who was doing hip-hop studies at the time, Greg made a critical intervention, not just into hip-hop-based education, but into hip-hop studies. Hip-hop studies was largely textual. It was mostly humanistic scholars that were doing close readings of rap songs. And that work was important, and Greg was one of the first people to enter that conversation, coming from the communications background and context, and really helping it make an ethnographic turn. And then Greg was speaking back to the critical pedagogy folk, and he was speaking back to the critical education folk, and saying that we need to not while we need a critical analysis, and Greg certainly had one, we can't prefigure what young people are doing. We need to be on the ground, understanding how they have these unique relationships to popular culture texts. And Greg did that through his work. He did that through relationships, and his scholarship did that. Greg had an adventurous mind. When Reading and Teaching the Postcolonial came out, I was like, I want to be that when I grow up. And I think he and Cameron, I mean, the work they did and the work that Greg did throughout his career marked that Greg was always looking for a new adventure. He didn't want to be contained by hip hop, although he knew it. He didn't want to be contained by post-colonial studies, although he was reading it deeply. He loved to read Baldwin and Basquiat, but he didn't want to stop there. Greg kept growing and learning and stretching, and I think it's really a lesson to all of us as scholars that we can be rigorously trained in a discipline, but we should never be prisoner to those disciplinary boundaries, and Greg never was. Every AERA, and this is the first one without Greg, which is incredibly painful for me, and I'm sure everyone here, we would meet and we would talk books. Apparently he did that with lots of people. I don't know when he went to sessions, because Greg would meet with people for hours, and we would sit there and just talk about books. And then I remember, I think it was maybe 2004 or something, I mentioned David Levinson-Lewis's volumes on Du Bois. And then he called me like 3 weeks later and had read both of them and had notes on them and notes on the notes. He had found this note on Dewey in the footnotes to the first volume of Du Bois, and then we talked about that. I mean, that's how Greg operated. He read deeply and he read closely and he never stopped growing. And lastly, Greg was as excited by the contributions and accomplishments of others as anyone else. I remember, Lois, he was, I guess it was when you were putting in the paperwork to become a distinguished professor. And Greg called me and he said, Marc, I got the best news. I am so excited. And I was like, what happened, Greg? I thought he became distinguished professor or something, you know? And he was like, Lois Weis. And he went through the whole story about the paperwork and what he had to do and how excited he was. And I had never seen an academic that genuinely excited about the success of others. Typically, that's sort of the opposite of academic culture. We just start counting people's Vitas and figure out whether they deserved it more than we did and such. Greg was the opposite. He was genuinely excited about the success of others, the achievement of others, the ideas of others. And so, this will be the first time that I don't see Greg walking through AERA with his binder and his wave and those light blue jeans and that green conference jacket he always wore. And the hug and the conversation and the books and the ideas and the thinking about his next project. And there was always a next project. And it was always a brilliant project. It was always an amazing project. And my only hope is that we all not just remember Greg, but that we use his life and his legacy and his work as a marker for what's possible, for moving beyond what we think is possible and doing even more, for continuing to learn and grow and share and love maybe each other before we have memorial services like this. When I see Cameron, who I've never had the chance to meet, to say I love your work, or Janet, I love you, thank you so much, and Lois and Michelle, this is what we need to do. Thank you. I know I have to go. Thank you all so much.
Gifts of Greg's wisdom, generosity, friendship, and intellect continue to live on with us. Today we've heard the many different yet similar ways these gifts impacted our lives and work and will continue so for many years to come. Over the past few months, Nadine and I have received several emails from people who just wanted the opportunity to share their grief, as well as similar to what we've done today, share their thoughts and stories that honor and celebrate Greg and the influence he had on their lives and work. Some of the people couldn't be here with us today, and one is Jane Kinley, who asked me to share her words with you. Jane writes, Greg, smart yet humble, warm yet a little reserved, critical yet in a considerate way, insightful engaged, thoughtful, and thoughtful. Generous, always generative. A fine intellect, a very good man. His passing has left a hole in our hearts. As Nadine mentioned at the beginning, we lost yet another incredibly generous and remarkable scholar in our community with the passing of Dennis Carlson. As many of you know, Dennis and Greg had a very close relationship. Both of them were often very eager to share just how much they admired and respected each other. Although we don't have the words that Dennis was planning to share with us today, I wanted to share what he posted on Facebook soon after learning of Greg's passing. He wrote, "Greg Dimitriadis was my closest friend in the profession for many years, and his death comes as a complete surprise to me. I am saddened